everybody hear this?
Yep.
Easy.
Three things in the speech. The first argument I'll prove is just why each facet of this policy does more harm than good, independent of how good the counterfactual is. This is for a few reasons. Firstly, we'll talk specifically about the 30% tax on capital gains and trust and getting rid of the CGT discount and indexing tax to inflation. This has a few problems. The first is just that it massively discourages investment into Australia. And that's for the reason that firstly, the tax is nominally huge at 30%, which just makes investment risky for very, very little reward when 30% of that is being taken away. But secondly, we would note that indexing inflation just raises the amount of tax that people have to pay, and we would note that this does not account for the risk of holding investments for a very long time, such as index funds. But thirdly, we would note that the CGT discount traditionally offsetted the problem of unrealized capital gains. That's to say, if you sold an investment too late and you did not sell it for as many gains as you could have, the CGT discount offsetted that loss, but now that loss is not offsetted. So what that means is that the nominal tax and the real tax is just huge. It means that it discourages huge amounts of investment into the domestic Australian economy. And we would note that this is a harm for the reason that, firstly, most people in Australia have a superannuation fund. A superannuation fund is just a 9 to 12% fund that businesses put into each individual's retirement income, and then those funds are invested into different investments. The problem now is that this cuts into the savings of many, many millions of people for their retirement. And we would note that Australia has one of the lowest savings rates in the world at 4%, which means that this is a very significant harm. But secondly, this is intuitively just bad for Australian businesses. It means they have less capital, which is incredibly bad in an environment where their economy is stagnating, where corporate tax is already at 30%, where it is already extremely hard for Australian businesses to expand, and when labour productivity is very, very low, which all explains that this is bad for Australian economic activity. But the second reason why this is bad is just to note that the burden is acutely affected on retail investors, small businesses and small family trusts. It is not affecting the biggest businesses the most. And that's for the reason that, firstly, minimum tax affects those in lower tax brackets. That's to say it affects the middle class more. But also, secondly, people who invest less are just more affected, right? Because they just get less returns in general if you invest less in the first place. But we would note that, thirdly, the trusts that are most likely to be affected under their side are people who lack accounting expertise to be able to dodge this. And that is the majority of people and the majority of trusts in Australia. For small businesses and farmers, it does not look like mining companies. It just looks like small farmers who are not able to dodge this. So that all explains why any changes to the CGT discount is bad. But secondly, let's talk about negative gearing. The problem with negative gearing is just that it backfires because there is a lock-in effect where the problem is that existing properties are grandfathered, so people don't sell their existing properties because otherwise they'll lose their negative gearing privileges. Instead, what they do is they just keep their existing properties, and that decreases the amount of liquidity in the housing market, which is extremely bad. And we would note that their policy only applies to new houses, but we'll explain in our second argument why there's actually more new houses under our side. And we would note that, lastly, combined, all of their policies just decrease housing investment. And that's for the reason that, firstly, as I explained before, there is no incentive to invest in real estate because of the amount of tax that there is on your returns now. But secondly, the most stupid feature about their policy is that it taxes all assets equally, like stocks and houses are taxed equally. And what that means is you don't move your money between different assets. You just double down on what has traditionally worked for you. And what has traditionally worked is real estate, which means that people double down in investing in their primary residence that they are already living in. They do not go to new homes, and that just increases the amount of that increases the housing bubble that is going to burst in Australia, which is why this policy backfires. The second argument I'll explain is just that in the counterfactual, there would have been a better tax reform package to solve the housing crisis. The first thing to explain is what a supply-side reform would look like, because their reform is demand-side. We'll explain that there will be a supply-side reform in the counterfactual. This looks like 4 things. Firstly, it looks like fast-tracking approval for new homes and apartments because Australia has a stupid amount of bureaucracy and regulation. Secondly, it looks like eliminating double redundancies in regulating checks, because currently you need to get regulation checks by the local, state and federal government. We would eliminate that redundancy. Thirdly, it looks like tax incentives for state governments to build housing because most housing in Australia is built by the state governments, not the federal government. And fourthly, it looks like more public housing by the federal government. The reason why this is likely is a fewfold. Firstly, we would note that Labor's election mandate was just to fix the housing crisis. It is the most salient political issue in Australia because it is the reason why inequality is increasing in Australia. Sydney is the second least affordable city in the world, and this is what voters care about the most. Secondly, we would note that this is just a binary. Like, you either solve the housing crisis through a demand side or a supply side policy. So under our side, you would just pick a different reform and you would go to the supply side reform. And I would note that this is thirdly completely within the government's power because it's largely deregulatory. Like, you're basically getting rid of useless regulations. You do not have to pass a lot of legislation, which all means the government is likely to do this. The next thing I'll explain is that this is clearly mutually exclusive. The reason why it is mutually exclusive is that a demand side reform and a supply side reform both affect existing owners, which means you cannot do both. That's to say, on their side, they're taking away advantages of getting a house and investing in a house. On our side, if you increase supply, you're reducing the value of houses. So either way, you're hurting homeowners, which explains why it's mutually exclusive, because you can't hurt them like doubly as well. So why does this solve the housing crisis? It solves the housing crisis very simply because the housing crisis is a supply side issue in Australia. That's for a few reasons. It's because, firstly, long-term fixed price contracts means that a lot of businesses and a lot of contractors and builders decided to enter in contracts before COVID, but then when materials started increasing costs after the 2022 Russo-Ukrainian war, the Iran war and COVID, now they're lacking inputs and now they're failing, and hundreds of businesses are just failing in Australia because they agreed to cheaper contracts before, but also because there is a limited amount of land in Australia in major cities. That's to say, Sydney is bordered by mountains, so you can't expand, and there's a lot of NIMBYism, which means you can't go up either, which we would get rid of. And solving the houses crisis is just important. It is the greatest source of inequality in Australia because your house or the cost of rent is the biggest cost to someone's income. So we clearly solve that better. The last argument I'll run is that this policy has contributed to the rise of the far right. Firstly, who is One Nation? One Nation is the far right populist party in Australia and is currently polling as the most preferred party in Australia. That's just for the reason that people are pissed off at legacy and establishment parties, primarily the ALP, so the Australian Labor Party, and the Australian Liberal Party, which is traditionally the centre-right party. And what that means is that a lot of people are turning to the far right because the far right has offered very simple solutions to very complex problems. The next thing I'll explain is that this policy has just cost Labor massively in the polls and it has favoured One Nation. And this looks like One Nation gaining seats in the upper house, so in the Senate, which means that the Labor has to negotiate with them more. It looks like them gaining seats in the lower house, which means that they can make a minority coalition. The reason why they have just gotten more seats because of this is, firstly, this policy targets farmers and it targets small businesses. It targets farmers in small areas who already think the establishment parties are giving up on them, and it means that they are turning to right-wing populism. And it targets small businesses who are just pissed off at both Labor and the Liberal Party. Notably, small businesses are unlikely to go to the Liberal Party for the reason that the Liberal Party actually ran on a higher tax promise last election, which means that the Liberal Party has not been getting the right-wing vote either, and also because the Liberal Party looks extremely milquetoast, but also because this pushes teal voters who are centre-right voters to One Nation as well. And we would note that Labor is preferable to One Nation because it is not discriminatory, it is not racist, but it is not populist, which means it has pragmatic solutions and complicated solutions instead of offering immigration as the only solution to every problem ever. For those reasons, vote affirmative.
Ready? The problem with the affirmative case is that they are uncomparative. They say, or concede the fact that maybe this is a harmful concession, that you probably need a lot of money because Australian Labour Party is welfare intensive in terms of the promises that they've already made. What this then means is this is resource intensive in terms of the promises that they have to cover and the promises that they have to manifest. What this then means is they have no counterfactual on how will you be able to earn extra state money or have money from treasury for you to manifest all these policies in the first place. And the likely counterfactual is just that you are likely to do a bunch of alternative things that are extremely worse than the tax that are imposing on rich people. Because let's characterize what capital gains taxes are. These are taxes on stocks, properties, and a lot of other things that are likely owned by rich people, because who even owns properties when Australia is already in a housing crisis? They selectively miss out this fact. These are landlords who own 3 to 4 houses or 4 to 5 houses, or investment manager firms like BlackRock or Vanguard that hold entire neighborhoods of single family owned houses. That then means you have all these rich people that are paying for all these poor people when they need welfare or when the promise is welfare, as opposed to, let's say, income taxes or inflation or anything in our alternative that we'll cover right now. What this then means is I just want to now start with 3 responses that take their premise down. There is no need metric for all of what they say, because first, businesses are not going to exit just because of this. They never prove a tipping point. There are 3 reasons why this is true. The first thing they say is nominally this is a high tax rate, so businesses will just leave. Read the info slide. These are like tax benefits that you are removing, like cost-based indexation. The second part of the info slide, if you want to read again, and a little amount of benchmark that you are setting in terms of 30%. It's a minimal tax rate that are existing. What is the current tax rate in Australia for capital gains? It's somewhere around 22 to 25%. Why is the 8% or 5% that you're paying extra the tipping point? And it's not even the fixed benchmark right now in the status quo. The private equity firms 28%, and on futures, options, and derivatives you already pay 32%. So you're just paying a minimum tax in the first place and standardizing all of this. Probably this makes companies perceive these taxes as ease of business, because they don't have to go through complicated tax codes and stuff like that for them to pay all these taxes, even if we concede to the frame that these are uniform and standardized. And second, they're not uniform, because see the info slide, this is a minimum 30% tax, not a standardized form of tax. Obviously, risky assets and more speculative assets will have more taxes. The third thing is just that Australia has unique advantages that are external to taxes. Probably this is the intuition pump as to reason why companies still stay in European countries or US with a lot of high taxes, and Australia also has the similar environment that all these Western countries give, which is one ease of business that you can do in terms of lack of corruption and more transparency, which means you have a lot of market access and market transparency, which is only useful for you, and monopolies can't be created, which means you can't be harmed just because oligopoly is favorite to a politician. The second thing is just that you have access to a very rich market. Sure, Australia doesn't have a lot of population such as China or India, but they have a lot of purchasing power at a point which they can spend a lot. You also have market incentive to stay in this market in the first place. If these companies didn't have an incentive already, they would have moved to Cayman Islands, they would have moved to like Seychelles, or they would have moved to any other tax shelter already. They need to prove a tipping point. On to our case then. There are 3 alternatives that are specifically worse than the case that we have right now. The metric from which you should judge this debate is that they point out a number of harms that are heavily mitigated right now or flipped right now, but we will just prove a greater harm than this to a more vulnerable stakeholder. What is the premise of this counterfactual? The premise of this counterfactual is that Australian Labour Party has promised a huge rate of increase in the already existing welfare policies that are already existing right now. What does this look like? The first is that this looks like increased budgetary proportion of welfare, healthcare, etc., and go ahead and increase public housing and acceptance of immigrants and stuff like that. The second is you will do an aggressive rise in the coverage of state-owned insurance and coverage of a lot of people in terms of their hospitals, Medicare, Medicaid, and the equivalents in Australia for access of social services. All of these policies are incredibly expensive, and there are 3 reasons now as to why ALP has a necessity to stick to these policies and manifest them on both sides. First, Australia isn't a government with a single dominant party in power. The margin that they have in parliament right now is razor thin, which means they have a constant threat looming over their head that if they don't manifest their policies, the right wing or the Conservative Party will just come ahead and capitalize the far right, as they say, and win over them, because these are small margins and you just have to manifest the swing voters. The second is that ALP is a coalition with parties that are more liberal or more socialist side of the spectrum. So this pressure from their side as well, they will remove support support if you don't manifest these policies. Third, even if there is no consequence on ALP as a party itself, there is consequence to MPs, because for individual members of parliament, even if the broader party wins, if they don't fulfill the policies, if they don't cater to the constituents, the MPs think they will lose the next election, and that's why they pressure the party head or they pressure the party's higher echelon for them to go ahead and manifest all of these policies. And all these three reasons explain why they will go through these resource intensive welfare policies on either sides. What is the likely counterfactual then? If you don't impose these capital gains taxes, if you don't remove these discounts on capital gains taxes, or if you don't remove these tax benefits that you have been giving ultra wealthy people, what is the problem with this is that these are incredibly expensive, and you're going to do three things that are uniquely bad. Even if you build one thing and one premise that I'm going to say, we should win this debate because the harms are so incredibly bad on a more vulnerable stakeholder. The first counterfactual is that the Australian government is probably likely to just take sovereign debt a lot to finance these expensive policies just by the virtue of how resource intensive these policies are. This is significantly worse than our side because of three reasons. The first is Australian debt to GDP ratio already is over the roof, and upon which you had to spend a shitload of money in the last 2 decades in similar welfare policies, especially including all the spending on immigrants that you have done. Australia is the biggest acceptor of immigrants in Oceania. Asia Pacific. What this then means is when you already have a bad credit score relatively, then what you did 10 years ago or what you did 15 years ago, or in International Bank of Payments and Settlements, or when you have a bad credit rating for your bonds, that means the interest that you have to pay would be high. And then you have to pay higher interest, you have to take more and more money monthly and yearly from every single budget that you have, which only eats away a lot of money that would have gone into social services, that would have gone into free hospitals, that would have gone into more access to education for minorities. The second is the yield for the bonds that you have is high. This just means because you are less credit worthy, because you have a less bond rating, that means the time to maturity is lower, the deadline for payment of your loans is lesser. When it's more constricted, you impose austerity measures. Those same austerity measures also mean you cut social services, you cut hospitals, you cut funding. All of this means the vulnerable people that are going to be affected instead of the rich, wealthy people that we talk about in the first minute of characterization that are going to be harmed on their side of the house. The second counterfactual is just that you're also equally likely to print more money, and upon which you want to fund all these policies. And the scale of money you have to print is huge because of how expensive the policy is. Why is this bad now? The first is the cost of day-to-day goods increases exorbitantly because this causes inflation. What this then means is that an average person is not able to afford eggs or bread or anything that they say, which means it flips their impacts to their side even more. The second is that the imports become more expensive, which means Australian farmers, which is the stakeholder that they care about, that they deem vulnerable, are not able to import things like fertilizers, or not able to import things like energy, and because it's a very energy dependent country in the first place. What this then means is incredibly harmful for the stakeholders. It's also harmful to businesses because of the sheer fact that you have a lot of businesses that are relying on imports as a part of the supply chain and value chain, and these businesses gets more demoralized, and this becomes more reason on their side for these businesses to exit out Australia. Just think about this. What's more of a reason for you to exit Australia or a country? Is it 2% or 3% or 5% more taxes, or is it you not being able to get raw materials or value chain as cheap as you used to get, which is so crucial for the cost of your products, which means you become uncompetitive against your things. The third counterfactual is simply that you increase income taxes, which is obviously bad because you increase it on an average person as opposed to a rich person taking the same burden.
Ready to go? Side negative is completely missed the point in the debate. They think our claim is that business will leave Australia. They think we're running a capital flight argument. We're not. We never fucking said that. Our claim is just that people will invest less, because if the capital gains discount just means that people have less money, which to invest, they sit on their money, or more money goes to the government, which just means that businesses have less money, which means less jobs, less innovation, less goods and services. They spend like 3 minutes rebutting an argument we didn't make. Secondly, they have no idea what the previous rate was. Like, they clearly don't know anything about Australia. The previous capital gains was about 5 to 10%, which means an increase from 5% to 30% is quite substantial, which does mean that there's a large change in the amount of investment there is, and there's a large change in the amount of money businesses have. So, at that point, we do just prove this fucks the Australian economy, it fucks the amount of money businesses have, and that is terrible. I'm going to deal with their main argument. Their main argument is, well, you need to increase government revenue somehow because the ALP has promised to increase spending. Clearly, this team knows fucking nothing about Australia. Firstly, Australia already has a very high tax rate, and we're in a budget surplus. Like, we literally have a surplus of government revenue, right? We don't need to raise revenue, which just means that your counterfactuals don't make any fucking sense. The first is, well, like, there'll be we'll go into debt. Firstly, we're in a budget surplus. We don't need to go into debt. Secondly, it's not a harm if we go into debt. Australia currently has a very, very low sovereign debt rate. So when they try to impact this by saying, oh, well, we're going to have a low credit rating, no, we're not. We're Australia. We compared to the rest of the world and other countries, very low sovereign debt in relation to GDP. So this is a completely fickle counterfactual because we're already in a surplus. Like, we can just dig into that money, and even if this counterfactual works out, doesn't fucking matter. Secondly, you say we're going to print money. They don't understand how the Australian monetary supply works. The ALP, which is the Australian Labor Party, the government, is different from the central bank, which is the RBA. The RBA controls the monetary supply, which just means that they can't print money. Like, the ALP does not control this, the RBA does. And the reason the RBA won't do this is because they're concerned about inflation. There was recent inflation in Australia at the end of 2025 because of increases in government spending. The RBA literally came out and criticised the government for spending too much and blamed them for inflation. What the RBA then did was they hiked interest rates in order to counter this inflation within Australia. So what that means is the RBA is concerned about inflation. So why the hell would they print money? This team knows nothing about Australia. Okay, cool. So that's the first problem with this claim. Just like, none of their counterfactuals work. We're in a surplus. So that's silly. Secondly, they're completely wrong. The ALP has not promised increases. In fact, they promised decreases. So what the ALP just did is they cut the NDIS. The NDIS is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. What it is essentially like the most extensive disability insurance scheme in the world. What they literally just did was they cut it because the ALP said it was too bloated. Like, this team just thinks, oh, left-wing government must have promised more welfare. Not true. We already have very, very strong welfare, pension and healthcare protections in Australia. Literally no one is calling for more. And the reason no one is calling for more is what I just said, that there has been an enormous amount of critique of Labor about government overspending leading to inflation, which leads to rate hikes. Because that overspending led to the higher cost of living, and those rate hikes mean that people who have mortgages and car loans with adjustable rate loans just have more money. Have high interest rates, which is bad for those people. So in fact, this is a completely fickle claim, right? Like, the ALP is not increasing spending. That is a complete lie. But the other reason you know this is true, and this is actually quite important, these were not election promises. It was so incredibly controversial in Australia when the ALP did this. Everyone was fucking up in arms because the ALP did not promise to do any of these things. It was a complete surprise. Australia was absolutely shocked. Read any major news headline, that's true. The importance of that claim is, how could it be true that they were doing this to fund election promise increases in welfare if this was not an election promise to increase these taxes? Those things literally cannot be true, right? So that just takes down their case. They did not promise to increase government spending, and even if they did, they could do it in other ways. Their case is completely gone. They know nothing about the ALP. And they also have promised, the other thing that they promised the election is to keep government spending and inflation low, because people are concerned about this. So that's done. Thirdly, Australia doesn't need more government spending. It has a strong welfare state. It has healthcare and pension systems. It has low inequality. So the question you've got to ask at this point, is it better for money to be in the government's hands, extra money to be in the government's hands, given that we have we literally have the lowest inequality in the developed world? It gives it better to be in the government's hands or the private sector and people's hands? And the answer to that question is, people just make better decisions. They know what to spend on. The private sector has more information. Consumers can allocate money to what is preferable to them, again, the government is often bloated, the government does not know what people truly want, and businesses employ people. So, even if they prove that we get more welfare or pensions or something, does not matter. There's extremely strong protections in Australia. That is a fickle claim. Alright, so at the end of that, they've completely missed the point. They do not realise what the current rate is, what the current income tax is, like any of it. But the biggest flip to this claim is that, well, if they're concerned about like cutting welfare or whatever, or irresponsible economic policy, the biggest flip is just that the counterfactual is One Nation, because this has been so incredibly unpopular in Australia. One Nation is the far-right party that's on the rise in Australia, and you might think, oh, well, this is not the tipping point, whatever. It actually is. Firstly, for all the reasons I said before, this was so incredibly uncontroversial because it was not an election promise. And, importantly, One Nation is currently preying upon the the disillusionment with the major parties, and this feeds into that, because it suggests that the major parties are not listening to people, and that One Nation would do better. Secondly, importantly, Labor literally lost the 2019 election promising to do negative gearing. So the leader was Bill Shorten, and even though Labor was leading polls going into that election, he lost the election and was credited because he promised to cut negative gearing. That was so incredibly unpopular. And the reason for that is just that the Liberal Party and One Nation weaponized rhetoric that, well, negative gearing is good because it allows young people to, for example, invest in property early, stay at home and use negative gearing to get into the property market. Thirdly, it's weaponized by One Nation because they are currently polling first. They prey on scandals. Pauline Hanson, the leader, does prey on this sort of thing. And this is the largest tax change in recent Australian history. So that does prove a tipping point. It does prove that this exacerbates the trend of One Nation rising, and it means they have more seats. Why is that incredibly bad? Firstly, One Nation is an extremely racist party. It uses inflammatory rhetoric around Asians in Australia and Muslim people in Australia. Their leader, Pauline Hanson, has said some truly horrific things about Muslims. She's done things like wear a hijab into Australian Parliament, which is like being incredibly divisive. Secondly, she's going to cut the government. Like, if you guys are concerned about not being able to fund welfare, she has literally promised to massively cut government jobs, entirely get rid of government departments. For example, our government department that looks after Aboriginal people, which are the Indigenous people within Australia. But thirdly, she's going to fucking destroy the economy, because she's going to end immigration, which is important for Australia because we need skilled workers, and she has no economic plans. And even if you don't believe that this means that Pauline wins the election, it means that she gets extra seats, which is bad because, firstly, this just means that she can force concessions from the ALP. She can do things like horse trading, because importantly, it is unusual to have a majority in the Australian Senate because it doesn't have proportional representation, which means that there's often more minor parties. So you need to horse trade with smaller parties, even if you're in power within the Australian Senate, to get any bills through. So she's just going to get concessions. And secondly, she could just block bills. She could literally just be in the Australian Labor Party, even if they're still in, cannot get bills through. So the importance of that claim is it just means that we flip their entire case. Like, if this means that Pauline and One Nation get more power, then everything they say might happen or could happen or is bad will just happen. So at the end of this, bloody hell, we win.
Just listen, zero down. Okay. Good. An average reasonable voter has absolutely no idea what Australian public feels about this policy because it is not reported on major newspapers. You need to buy, if this policy leads to good changes, public possibly will feel good about it. They need to specify who are the stakeholders who are leading this campaign against the Labour Party and leading to One Nation. They can just come and lie that One Nation has 100% of the votes. Are we supposed to just believe it? We shouldn't. Which means they need to logically prove why this possibly leads to rise of One Nation. They haven't done so. I will explain to you why this policy leads to benefits for each and every stakeholder within Australia, or at least more stakeholders within Australia, and therefore all of the Australia public would be happy with it. The only concession that they could demand is that this policy at its beginning possibly had bad reactions, but as this policy is implemented and leads to impacts, it will automatically have good reactions, and that means as long as we prove that this policy leads to good outcomes, we win each and every clash in this debate. The first policy they talk about is a minimum 30% tax on capital gains and trust distribution. This is the policy which possibly, according to them, discourages spending within the stock market and discourages spending within houses. The first thing I want to point out that when you spent into stock market, a lot of the money goes into publicly listed companies. A lot of these companies are extremely rich, have multiple avenues of getting this money. They possibly get it from private equity fund, loans from banks, multiple other avenues such as mutual funds that directly invest in them, or hedge funds that directly buy their shares from the secondary market. As long as they can get this money, it doesn't matter, because they possibly are quite profitable because they are listed in the stock market. What you need to understand is what people do when they don't invest in the stock market. They keep their money in their banks, as they told you, which means people either invest in fixed deposits because it's not capital gains, you can still gain the exact amount of return, maybe only 8 to 9%, or they give the money to government bonds. So the counterfactual of this is quite simple. People just keep money in the bank, or they invest in fixed deposits, which means banks generally have more money. This is basic economic analysis. If banks generally have more money to lend, that means they are more liberal with lending. They are lending money to more people. Remember the crisis they talked about, where a lot of people could not complete construction after the 2022 crisis, because of which they were not able to buy raw materials. How will they buy raw material? Will they buy raw material through stock market investment? Because these are possibly not public entities. These are possibly entities that are smaller and don't have money. They buy raw material and they complete their construction through bank loans. And they will get bank loans where banks have a lot of money to lend and are capable of lending this money at a liberal rates. Which means on our side of the house, when people don't invest in stock markets, they keep money in the banks. Banks get more money. They lend money to more people. It's not only that they lend money to new businesses, simply because bigger businesses possibly still already have bank connections and get lending anyways. When they get more money, they lend to new businesses and more small and medium enterprises, because of which more people get access to businesses. Employment also increases within local areas due to this. But more importantly, they also lend to people because personal loans become more common. They are willing to give more home loans than they were giving before. They are willing to give more car loans than they were giving before. So as a result of this policy, even if people don't understand this policy in the first month, it's quite likely that over the next 2-3 years, banks will be more willing to give home loans, banks will be more willing to give car loans, because of which people will gain these benefits, and therefore they will like this party. Parties are not stupid. They will be able to market this policy as a success simply because of the impact that they have created, and this data is quite visible that more people are able to buy homes. The second thing I want to point out, that investment in home is the worst thing possible. Remember that all the investors who buy homes buy it for their own profitable gains. They don't live here. They just want to rent it and charge higher amount of rent from people to make sure that they are making the highest possible gains possible. Who invests in home? People who already have a home they live in, and they want to invest in a second home so that they can capture as many homes as possible. Given the number of homes being built in Australia are limited, it's quite, because of their own reasoning, land is limited, it's very expensive, it's quite likely that investment in homes simply decreases the amount of homes available to new buyers. On our side of the house, home loans become far easier, because of which people have access to the money to buy new homes, but also now because new homes aren't being hoarded by all the investors and private equity firms, they have the access to these homes being available at a market rate that is still good, because of which people are able to take these home loans and buy these homes at a reasonable price, rather than the price hiking and private equity firms just hoarding all these properties so that they can sell them later at a higher price. This also reduces the possibility of a bubble, which they also point to, simply because at the point when you are able to rationalize the housing market, you can make sure that people aren't falling into a bubble-based pricing and aren't buying houses at sky-high prices, because these prices will be rationalized due to decrease in investment. They are like finance bros who say investment into your stock market is amazing. We don't know why, because these are all big companies, public limited companies with billions of dollars in revenue. Why do we care if investment goes to them? Investment going into banks, and therefore banks giving this money out to normal people, average people, is what makes their life better. Which means at the end of all of this, the government would be able to say the number of people who owned homes 5 years back were very less. Now more people own homes, and therefore we have created success for them. The number of small businesses that existed back then was very less. Now we have a lot more, and therefore we have succeeded. And even if people in Australia might be a little bit right-wing, they are quite good at reading, because the education rate is quite high. They have a lot of social awareness. So when they see that this policy has been a success, they are quite likely to benefit from this policy, and they are likely to vote for the government, because this has rationalized the market and increased housing for each and everyone out there. If all of this is true, none of their benefits stand. But their argument on right-wing rise somehow believes that all Australians are crazy and they just believe in anti-immigration. If that is so, why were they supporting immigration till now? The arguments about we need skilled workers coming from their speech simply means that one nation cannot rise at a rate that it becomes significantly important. If their best argument is one nation will win some more seats, I'm not sure why that is such a big harm that we should care about. Obviously, they are not going to be able to implement the policies that they are talking about. At best, one more seat means they will have a little more voice in parliament. Giving more voice to right wing doesn't necessarily mean that they are bad. Suppressing the right wing reduces recruitment. If they have a little bit more voice, if they simply voice out their issues in a manner that the public feels that okay, these issues are being voiced out, they are being discussed in parliament, and they feel more validated rather than being more and more extreme. So that's obviously a good thing. I'm not necessarily sure why they will be able to implement really, really bad policies. The last thing they say is that existing homeowners will not sell their properties because of the negative gearing. They haven't given incentives as to why existing homeowners would ever sell their property. Very many people just live in their homes, and even if some homeowners could have sold their property, the rate of this would be very, very low. The more rate of property that's available is new construction, which will be available to people when investors don't hog them up, and therefore these are more available properties that people can buy and get more homes into. I just want to point out that their counterfactual that they point out are three things. First, that you need to fast track approval. Second, you need to give tax incentive to the state governments. Third, you need to build a lot of public housing. My problem is all of this requires a lot of money. Look at their first speech. After the 2020 crisis, Australian government has suffered huge losses and businesses are suffering. Look at their second speech. Australia has a huge revenue positive and we have all the money in the world. They can't be true at the same point of time. After the COVID crisis, every country in the world suffered. None of the stock markets have recovered and nobody has done significantly well. So if they are lying to you and you believe it, that's okay. But more importantly, even if you believe it, we win simply because on our side of the house, more money is available. Therefore, we can build more public housing, tax incentives. None of their counterfactual is exclusive because when more money is available, we can do all of this on our side of the house as well. So we do obviously limit the stock market a little bit, and that's amazing. That's really good because we are able to redirect money to banks and give this money to people. But we are also able to do all the policies that they require to solve the housing crisis. If they believe that budgets can be shifted very normally and you can give public housing without making more money, they are possibly missing the point because most countries have already allocated budget into different sectors, and to bring new policy they need new budget, and this budget can only come when you create new tax policies to make sure that you are taxing people a lot. On our side of the house, if we are increasing tax from 10 to 30%, then we are making a huge load of money and we can use this money for public housing. They haven't given reasons as to why this won't happen if that's their counterfactual. Proud to approve.
Could I put the back like 30 seconds straight here?
Oh yeah, do you want me to wait for you?
I'll enter if that's fine with you.
I'll just wait.
Yeah.
Good to go. I'll start by cashing in our free wins on housing saving investment. Then I will deal with their only argument, which is that this gives the government more money to spend. That argument goes to bust. Firstly, on housing, we give you two mechanisms to explain why we solve the housing crisis. Firstly, to no response, that this is mutually exclusive to a supply-side reform that is necessary because housing is a problem of not enough homes, not too many buyers. And secondly, that perversely this side discourages investment into new homes because they have less money to invest. What are the responses that we receive? The first response we get is that our supply-side housing reform costs the government money. Listen to the argument. Our supply-side reform is removing government regulations. It's deregulation. Deregulation doesn't cost money. It saves the government money from having to do those regulatory approvals. It saves the money of housing developers to meet the cost of regulation. So that's why our policy is in fact what frees up money. The next thing they say is that, well, the problem is that landlords in your world just buy up all the properties. So how does that trickle down? Firstly, What they do in their world is, in our world, is they have more money to stake for new projects, new homes. They don't have that money in their world because that money is being taxed away by the government. The next thing that we say is that obviously they're buying those properties for a reason. It's to rent out. So even very worst case, all they do is spend their money on buying up luxury apartments. That's good because new people can move from their shitty apartments into those luxury apartments. Those shitty apartments get freed up for people who otherwise are in public housing or in far less homes. So that is why we create a vacancy chain. As long as you build housing supply somewhere, that trickles down and people do benefit. So that means that the remainder of our housing argument goes untouched. Why is this simply the most important impact in this debate? And it's so much more important than any more money for welfare. For 3 reasons. Firstly, it's the far greater imperative. I'm very proud to be an Australian, and that is because Australia has the greatest universal healthcare system in the world. We have a system like HECS, which is interest-free loans for tertiary education. We have a very strong welfare net. By comparison, I'm ashamed to say that Australia has the worst housing prices in the world. The median house price in Sydney is 100 times the average income. The average renter spends half of their income for the price of simply keeping up a roof over our head. So we tackle the far worse problem. Number 2, we affect more people because everyone benefits from cheaper housing and cheaper rents, but not everyone benefits from the additional gains that they add to the welfare net that otherwise wouldn't capture those people. Thirdly, because we equalize on vulnerability, because it is the most vulnerable that rent, and we lower rental prices to get more rental properties on the market. And because we build more public housing, which frees up and gives properties to the homeless. So, because we equalize on vulnerability, which is their only metric, but we have a slam dunk look on housing, I think we've already won the debate. The next way we win this debate is by explaining this gives more money to people, for their ordinary Australians, for their saving and for their investments. What are the responses that we receive? The first is, well no, the alternative would be an income tax. They never explain why. It's obviously way less popular because everyone earns an income. That won't be the alternative. Their better claim is to say, well now, people will keep their savings in the bank, and that's good. No, it's not, because when you keep your savings in the bank, those real value of the savings erodes because the inflation exceeds and outpaces the interest rate that you get from those savings. That's why people don't want to put their money in the bank. They then say, well, this gives banks more ability to lend. But the problem is that we give banks more money to lend because people gain from the capital's gain that they otherwise have to pay, and they put that money into the bank. So obviously we give banks more money because we give people more money in the pocket in the first instance. They then say it's important for banks to give out loans, but banks can't just give out loans willy-nilly. They have to be willing to assure that people will be able to pay back the loan. With what assets will people stake up for collateral for loans in their world? You have taken away their assets because you've discouraged their ability to invest in capital gains that could be staked up as collateral for those loans. So if you care about lending, you should care about our side because our side gives people more money at the end of the day and puts their money into their pockets first. They then say, well, people will just simply invest in government bonds. Last time I checked, a capital? So it will be taxed by capital gains tax. And that's actually a pretty convenient argument for us, because this also discourages and undermines an important source of revenue for the government, which is government bonds. They mean that people are less likely to invest in government bonds, because government bonds is an investment, so will be taxed in our world. So, bad luck to you guys. So, I think their broad kind of claim under this is that, well, you only help like really rich guys, whereas like everyone else is like super poor. There's obviously a middle ground. The middle ground is the average Australian who is middle class, who would benefit from having more money they can pay towards rent, towards the education and futures of their children. And this team takes away all that money. I'm going to give you so many reasons as to why this is likely to affect the middle class. Firstly, because everyone in Australia has a superannuation account, and that's forced savings for the government into investment, which their side taxes. And secondly, because this tax disproportionately affects the middle income, because they're the people most likely to be affected by an increase in the minimum tax holding, because they put in the minimum investment, and because they simply invest less. So a 30% increase is a bigger chunk of their relative income and investment compared to a very rich person. So this disproportionately does affect the middle income. But even if it doesn't, even if it only affects rich people, the point is that investment is into companies which do affect and employ poor people. They're like, these companies are super rich, but it's a question of margins, right? Companies have more money in our world, and when companies have less money, who are the first workers they lay off? They are the least productive, the lowest paying workers. And that is bad because those workers are the most vulnerable. So they can never explain how this doesn't trickle down to the most vulnerable. That is precisely why their side is far, far worse. So we put more money into savings and we put more money into firms that can employ people, that can create services, that create innovation, and it is what drives economic growth. And that is the most important benefit, because their best claim is about inequality. But the best way to solve inequality is not by making the pie smaller, it's about growing the pie for everybody so that you have more surplus to redistribute. And that's the problem with their claim. I will now deal with their claim on why this gets the government more money. I will flip this. It's actually likely that they make government get less money, because all they do is increase the rate of this particular taxation, but they undermine the overall pool of revenue in a myriad of ways. Firstly, because they discourage investment. So if the 30% capital gains tax is too high, people don't put any money to tax to begin with, which is why people don't invest in them, or they don't even recoup the tax revenue. Number two, because it erodes investment in government bonds, as I've previously explained. And thirdly, because less investment into firms means that firms hire less people, which means that people have less money, which people don't spend, and that shrinks the overall pool of the economy and the overall pool of taxpayers, so the overall pool of taxation goes down in their world. The next thing that we say, so that's why I think all those reasons suggest that the government revenue goes down. They also try to mitigate this at first negative, because they're like, well, the capital gains tax is already pretty high. If that's true, then you claim a very marginal increase in the capital gains tax. But what you don't symmetricize is the fact that that burden is still disproportionately too high for middle income people, because a 10% extra tax means a lot if the only thing that you're putting in is $15,000. That's already $150. So that's why they have just marginalized their own benefit without marginalizing the harms to savings and tax. The next thing they say, and this is critical, they assume that the government in charge will be a government responsible for welfare spending. We say it probably won't be. It will be the far right, or it will be a significantly weakened Labour government that has to pay concessions to the far right. The far right who do not give a shit about the poor. And their laughable responses at second deck are like, oh, we haven't structurally proven it. Oh yeah, read a newspaper. A. B. You know how I can structurally prove it? Look at the Western world. The far right is rising everywhere. Why would Australia be an exception? Trump, Marine Le Pen, the far right in Hungary, every other nation, like reform UK, like everything in the Western world is succumbing to the right, the far right, and that is precisely because they play up on people's cultural anxieties and disenfranchisement with mainstream politics, and this is what will break them. Labour promised to not touch capital gains taxes before the election. That was their promise, and it's the promise that this time breaks, which is why the far right goes into power, and for the fourth time we've won this debate. Ready?
First, I want to tackle their premise, which is that Australia is already in a budget surplus and the ALP is not increasing spending on their social policies. I know it sounds like, especially after the second affirmative speech, that, oh, this is an Asian team, they probably don't know anything about Australia, and we are an Australian team, so whatever we say, we get away with it. There are two problems with this case, though. The first is that I pirate The Economist every single week, and I know for a fact, as an OIB, that the Australian debt to GDP ratio right now is quite high. They are not in a budget surplus, that's a straight up lie. If their analysis for why far right is on the rise is that, oh, far right is on the rise everywhere, well then the debt to GDP ratio for each country is on the rise around the world. Insofar as that's the case, it's likely on the rise for Australia as well. This was a complete assertion on their side. But I want to flip based on their own argumentation. At one point, they say that Australia has suffered a crisis in 2020 and they're trying to recover from it. You only recover from a crisis if it has hit your GDP, if it has hit your economy. So the only world in which the 2020 crisis has had any economic impact is a world in which you end up having more debt, and this is a debt that you're trying to solve. They say that the far right is coming to power, but on what basis? They don't explain. I would argue that this is likely because the debt to GDP ratio is quite high. This is exactly how Trump got into power as well. So at the end of the day, you have to believe believe the argument that to a certain extent the debt to GDP ratio is quite high, and you also have to believe their argument, which is quite true, that you need to solve the housing crisis. This debate just becomes about where do you solve the housing crisis better without putting people into more debt. This is the first argumentation that comes on their side. That premise is assertive. I give you two flips to explain why the debt to GDP ratio is quite high. One of them is dependent upon me pirating The Economist every week, which is quite true, and I do know it. The second thing they say is that businesses just invest less and there is no capital flight. But I want you to gut check this as the panel. Is this true though? Do businesses just invest less? If you invest less in the Australian stock market, you invest more in the American stock market, because according to their own analysis, businesses want to make money. Insofar as this is true, businesses go out to other capital markets, which means Vishwa's analysis for why these businesses, even when the rate increases on our side a bit, still applies. We are still able to prove that on our side, businesses will remain in Australia. Their argument has to be capital flight and nothing else. They resist they resist harm that the first harm that Gov points out is just that people will stop investing in Australian stock markets. Like I said, people will stop investing in Australian stock markets, right? But there are two more things you need to note on this. The first is that you can tax Australian stock market gains, but you cannot tax American stock market gains. So the point at which people flow out and invest in other places, because businesses are going to invest regardless, on their side all of this money goes to American shareholders. If this money doesn't come back to like Australian shareholders, it's less likely that you can reinvest in Australian economy. It's less likely that you build more homes. It's less likely that you have more money within banks that these like companies are putting, or the loans that they're taking. So on our side, when you invest in the Australian stock market, that's just a good thing. And I want to be clear here. Vishwa's analysis still applies as to why you probably remain. Guys, one second, be a bit quiet, right? The second thing is that on our side, you get money in the stock market, which is a good thing in and of itself. On their side, when it goes to the American shareholder, American companies, it goes to the shareholders. I would like to argue what Anshuman already proved, which is that a lot of people put money into banks. I would argue that this is a good thing, because when you invest in the stock market, and this is their best case, that people start investing less in the stock market, I would argue that's fine, because when you invest in the stock market, all of this money goes to the shareholders who take this as profit for the investment they had put in initially. But when you put it in banks, banks give this out as loans that people can use to buy more houses, especially young people. Rich people who often buy homes can just buy homes from the profits they're making every year on their capital gains, or the profits they're making just from their income from the money they're saving. But the people who need the loans the most are the people who belong to the middle income classes. These are usually younger people. These are people who oftentimes need to take loans for education. So a system in which more and more money is put into banks, even if FDs aren't as profitable as other things are, young people do get more money in this economy. And insofar as they're not able to prove on the counterfactual why this government gets more money, they can't prove why the average life of a middle income earner gets better. On our side, this becomes significantly better because they have access to more capital. So on their side, money goes to stock market. Their argument is that magically the economy gets better. On our side, we're able to structurally prove to you how money gets into banks, and banks are able to lend this out to middle income households, and how these middle income households get better. You have to pick and choose which benefit you like. Their fairy argument on how stock market getting bigger is good and leads to some benefits, or our argument where middle income homes get more money to reinvest in education, reinvest into like housing, reinvest into like transportation and stuff like that is better. Gov also assumes that people who are going to build houses are going to be taxed on their side. This is simply just not true. Of course, people who are going to be taxed are people who are buying second and third homes. These are people who are like reselling and selling homes again and again. These are not people who are building new houses. So if their argument is that our policy is mutually exclusive, we're going to build more housing, that happens on our side as well, because you're not taxing new houses, you're taxing the constant reselling of houses in this case. I want to be very clear on the benefits here, and because this is the last delta in this debate. On their side, the stock market gets bigger, the money goes to shareholders, they don't establish the link for how you get the end impact of an Australian life improving. On our side, the money goes into banks, the banks lend this out to a middle income household, this middle income household takes out an education loan to make their child study, or they take out a loan to start a small business. This improves the Australian economy, especially the post-2020 crisis. So, to be clear, in this debate there is a neat metric that has been established, which is that the Australian economy isn't doing that well, especially after the 2022 crisis, which they concede to. If this is the case, then average income earners need to earn more because rich people will be fine on either sides. On their side, rich people who invest in the stock market get richer probably. That is true. But on our side, it's the middle income households that get better. They get better education, they get better transport, and you get more money for the government to fund their policies. On their side, maybe you have a decent amount of money to fund social policies. But on our side, you simply have more, and that's an end benefit that you have to credit in this debate. Insofar as that is true, all of Anshuman's benefits do apply, which is that investment in banks, through banks, is a good thing. And even if the right-wing party gets a couple of seats in the parliament, that itself necessarily isn't bad, because then they just feel more heard. Their claim is assertive that this party will just come into power. I would argue that you come into power by other things. You come into power by using racist rhetoric, which has nothing to do with the economy. So the likelihood of this party getting into power is equal on either side at their best. But I would argue that when they are in the parliament and when they have a bit more voice, they don't try to be as suppressive or as rhetorically extremist as they were before. So on our side, this is better. Lastly, I just again want to tackle their housing problem. So they say that the housing problem is a supply side problem and they're going to solve that. The first thing I want to point out, they say this is mutually exclusive. They don't explain why this policy is mutually exclusive. We are able to explain that on our side, new houses are not being taxed, right? It's houses that are being resold that are being taxed. So this policy can exist on our side as well. But the second is that we explain to you, when you have more money that's put within banks and banks can loan it out, more housing is just naturally built on our side. You don't need a policy push because banks are more willing to lend out money. People are more willing to take these loans because they clearly want housing. But their own argumentation is that there is limited land in Australia. If there is limited land in Australia, how do you just build more housing? They never explain this. I don't think they're able to solve the housing problem. The nuance in this debate is that the housing crisis comes because there are a lot of rich people in Australia that have become wealthier with time, who, if they need one home, will now buy 3 homes and they just hold the other 2 homes and they resell it later on in future. So the crisis comes not from that there just isn't enough housing. It's that there isn't enough housing to rent or to buy. There are 2 things to note on this. The first is that people who just keep reselling homes from $500,000 to $700,000 don't do this anymore, which means the housing bubble decreases on our side. But the second is that the moment this policy is enforced, we instantly create liquidity in the housing market because people who want to avoid paying a higher tax on this policy now want to invest in this housing and sell their housing ASAP. Insofar as that happens, middle income households can buy these houses.
Thanks, negative. The prior to negative whenever you're ready.
The question in this debate becomes, can you win this debate by lying? Because companies hire their workers and pay for their salaries from the profits they get. Stock market's investment go to the hands of shareholders and not to the bank account of the company. Which means if I'm a big company, I possibly am making a huge profit. This is how I pay my workers and keep them still. Garg response is, because their shareholders are making less money, they would fire workers without any connection between it. Similarly, their argument is, because people have more taxes on capital gains, they would stop building more houses. But building more houses isn't a capital gain, it's a business income. When you buy a property and then sell this property, this is a capital gain. So if a company has a property, they have built a house, it's a business income and therefore doesn't come under capital gain. At all points, all arguments are dependent upon we lying to people. Because look at their first argument. Australian pension fund invest in Australian stock market and pension will decrease. Raghav tells you they can invest in US stock market and still make the same amount of money and can be totally okay with it. Second, people will not invest in fixed deposits because it's less than inflation. Lie. Fixed deposits pay you always more than inflation, nearly 7 to 8% in every country. Australian inflation rate is 3%. If their argument is that this particular company was making 12% return from the stock market and it is decreasing to 9%, then fixed deposit is much more certain and that is why people invest in it and therefore the argument still stands. Most people in the world go into safer methods when the unsafer methods are taxed more and more. This is just basic economic logic that we go with rather than saying Australia this, Australia that. Also, I don't think there is value to saying that this all is being reported in international newspapers. Sadly, not every political conversation is reported, but also an average reasonable voter doesn't read through the entire news cutting, just goes through the overall headlines. So we possibly don't know how many seats these right-wing parties have or whatsoever. What exactly is their argument then? Their argument is, we will solve the supply side problem, which is we will build public housing and we will give state subsidies so that they are able to subsidize public housing. Or they will give subsidies to a lot of builders. This comes in first. Apart from relaxing government regulation. Obviously, in order to do all these three things, you need money and land. In the first, they have explained that there is very little land available in Australia right now that is available for construction because a lot of cities cannot be expanded. Unsure as to how they will solve it. But to solve this, they need money. And apart from the assertion that Australia is the healthiest economy in the world and is the only economy that has a budget surplus, they haven't explained where will you get this money from. And listen to the government speech. They say again and again, we solve the housing crisis problem by building public housing. But where does this money come from? We get this money on our side of the house simply by taxing people and therefore solve the crisis better. But what happens on our side is quite simple. And this is an intuitive benefit of the motion. People stop buying additional homes as an investment. People only buy homes to live there. So the government response is, a family that is living in a bad home would move to a good home. The thing is, they are moving to live there permanently or for a long period of time. So they are not buying it as an investment on capital gains. They are buying it to move there as a family. So that response obviously doesn't work. So a lot of people who want to buy homes to live there would get access to more homes that already exist. Remember, given these homes already exist, we don't need policy implementation to change them. So regardless of what this party does, regardless of what the economy becomes, as long as investors stop hogging upon home and increasing rent, people can get the money to move into these new homes, and obviously they get more better bank loans as a result of this policy as well. All of this means that people get access to a lot of homes that will be occupied by big corporations or by really rich people, or otherwise who are selling it at a very high price as a means of investment. On our side of the house, people get access to home networks. You remember how I explained that this data is available? All of this welfare can be advocated by the Labour Party in the media 4 years later, and they can still win the election. There was absolutely no response to that. Proud of it.
Thank you for the reply. Lastly, affirmative reply when you're ready.
First, why we better solve the housing crisis. This is for three reasons. Firstly, we established that counterfactual is deregulation and incentives to build. Their only response to say this is not mutually exclusive. The reason we give it mire, which they never rebut, is any housing reform under their side or our side hurts homeowners, which is a powerful group in society, because it depresses prices, which is bad for them. That explains that it's unpopular, is bad for a very powerful group, which means you can only do so much and is mutually exclusive. The reason we explain that our counterfactual is better is that the housing crisis is a supply side issue, not a demand side issue, and we solve supply. The second reason we solve the housing crisis is that they create illiquidity, because this team seems to assume that they're getting rid of negative gearing for everyone, but no, read the info slide, there is an exception for people who already have existing negative gearing, which means that they never have an incentive to sell now because they want to hold on to that negative gearing. They can't just sell and get another property. That creates illiquidity in the market, which just means that it decreases supply. They never respond to this mechanism. It's very important. Our third mechanism, which they give a weak response to, is that there's less investment in new homes because capital gains also applies to new homes. They get this wrong. They say that capital gains only applies when you buy a home and then sell it. That is not true. It applies when you spend money to build a home and then you sell it. That is a capital gains. That is factually true. So, they never give a meaningful response to our three reasons why we solve the housing crisis. That one's us to debate up front. Let's talk about their claim this is necessary to fund government spending. Firstly, if you believe their framing that taxes are high and government debt is high, and you believe our framing that inflation is currently an issue, why the hell would the ALP increase government spending? We explained that these cuts were not an election promise. In fact, Labor promised to cut inflation and cut spending. Secondly, Australia already has a very strong safety net, and the private sector uses this money better. Thirdly, at third affirmative, we flip this claim because we explain that if the economy is less productive, the government has less tax revenue, and that is in fact the real way in which the tax revenue is lower. Maybe they increase the percentage of tax, but we grow the pie. And fourthly, we explain that if you really care about government spending, you should be scared of the far right, or a weakened Labour government that has to make concessions to the far right. And they just give extremely lazy responses, talking about, well, it's not on the newspaper, whatever. Labour promised to not touch capital gains and negative gearing. They now did this, and One Nation is racist, they'll cut government departments and they'll destroy the economy. That was an enormous claim. Lastly, why do we get more investment? Their only lazy response is that, well, this only goes to shareholders. Investment creates jobs, innovation, and goods and services. We explained at Third Affirmative that cuts mean that the poorest people, the most vulnerable people, will lose their job first. Economic growth helps everyone. You'd rather have a larger pie than a slightly bigger slice of a poorer pie. The other thing they say is, well, this only applies to Australian businesses and not investments in American businesses. This is not true. It applies to all investments from an Australian person, but even using their logic against them, it is bad if people now invest in American businesses rather than Australian ones, for the reason that America is a wealthier economy than Australia, so you ought to prioritise that stakeholder. Lastly, they say it's better for banks to have more money. We rebut this handedly at the Affirmative. When firstly, we say that banks are now not willing to give loans because there's no collateral and there's no sureness that they are able to be paid back. And secondly, that there is a smaller pool of money overall, which means that less money is able to lend out in general. Lastly, we simply win on inequality because we explain that this is an increase in the minimum capital gains, which does not hurt the richest people, it hurts the poorest people because it's the minimum threshold. We also explain that this hits people without accounting expertise who are unable to dodge these taxes, and we explain that the tax hits people with low income more. We win on inequality, we win on the housing, and we win on investment. They really have no win path in the debate, given that they change it speaker to speaker.